Hey everyone, welcome back to Sip and Talk.
You know, trying to follow international news sometimes, it feels like you're looking at two different maps for the same place, right?
Yeah.
Especially with big global players, the reports can seem totally contradictory.
Oh, absolutely. It's a real maze of information out there. Trying to figure out the actual strategy behind the public statements, that's tough. And our sources today, they really get into that.
And that's exactly what we're trying to help you with here. We've got this stack of source materials for this deep dive, and they specifically look at China's approach to international relations.
Mm-hmm.
We're really focusing on how these sources say China frames things, narratives about the U.S. and Taiwan specifically, and then crucially, how these documents suggest that framing sometimes seems to clash with their actions, especially towards neighbors in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, the sources we're looking at, they pull from all sorts of places, official statements, media reports, both state and international, trade data too, and records of military stuff right up to early 2025.
So our mission, like always, is to kind of boil this down for you. We'll pull out the key patterns, the specific examples the sources are highlighting, just to help you cut through that noise and get a clearer sense of what the information itself seems to be telling us. Okay, let's unpack this.
Okay, so according to these sources, a really key part of China's communication strategy is, well, strategically framing certain groups negatively. They really zoom in on how the U.S. and Taiwan's ruling party, the DPP, are often portrayed.
And the sources dig into the why, right? They don't just say it happens. What do these documents suggest are the reasons behind this kind of framing?
Well, they point to a few things that are kind of linked. Domestically, they suggest this negative framing is pretty important for keeping things stable and, drumming up that nationalist support.
So it's partly about managing things at home.
Exactly. The sources suggest that by pointing to external threats or enemies, it maybe helps the government shift focus away from potential internal issues, economic slowdowns, social stuff, things like that.
Yeah, that's a classic move, isn't it? Unite against the outsider.
It is. And then geopolitically, the sources indicate this framing helps China push its own interests and boost its influence regionally and, well, globally, too. It kind of gives them a justification for their actions on the world stage.
And how do these narratives actually get spread? According to the sources, what channels are they using?
The sources consistently mention state-controlled media being huge, obviously, official diplomatic statements, too, and increasingly these quite sophisticated information campaigns online across different platforms.
Right. Got it. So let's get specific then. How do the sources describe this whole U.S. is bad narrative? What kind of examples do they pull out?
Well, the reports detail this really consistent line from China, accusing the U.S. of basically trying to hold China back to contain its growth.
And they show how China pushes this message.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The sources note how China tends to, well, maybe exaggerate the U.S. threat, which, again, feeds into that domestic nationalism we talked about. Like, reports from 2025 specifically mention China calling U.S. semiconductor restrictions tech bullying.
Tech bullying? Huh. That's quite a phrase. What else do the sources put under this U.S. is bad banner?
Well, sources from 2024, they highlight these really strong accusations about the U.S. interfering in China's internal affairs, thinking Hong Kong, Xinjiang specifically. They even quote official Chinese statements labeling the U.S. a human rights hypocrite.
So kind of deflecting criticism about their own record by pointing fingers back at the U.S.
That's certainly one way the sources frame it. They also detail a lot of criticism about U.S. military moves. For example, analysis of those U.S., Japan, Philippines joint drills back in February 2025. China portrayed them as disrupting regional peace, basically painting the U.S. as the troublemaker in the Asia-Pacific.
So positioning China as the stable one, the defender of peace, while the U.S. is the provocateur.
That seems to be a core part of the narrative, yeah.
Yeah.
The sources also track how this view spreads on social media, this whole idea of American hegemony. And here's another interesting bit the sources highlight. China often talks itself up as a defender of multilateralism, free trade.
Okay. But then what happens?
Well, at the same time, the sources detail things like China slapping retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods, coal, LNG, oil, farm products, cars in February 2025. And China's reason, they said the U.S. was violating WTO rules.
Yeah.
So their tariffs were framed as just a necessary response, not as, disrupting trade themselves.
So saying we love free trade, but then using tariffs and blaming the other guy.
It's a pattern the sources note. Action, then the narrative to justify it. They also talk about China's export controls on critical minerals, things like bismuth, indium, Publicly, it's about national security. But the analysis in the sources, it strongly links these controls directly to the U.S. semiconductor limits, like hitting back by limiting U.S. access to needed resources.
It really feels like, based on these sources, any U.S. action seen as a challenge gets spun negatively to justify whatever China does next.
That's the dynamic these documents seem to lay out.
Yeah.
Now, should we look at the DPP as bad narrative, focusing on Taiwan's ruling party?
Yeah, let's do that. How do the sources say China frames the DPP?
Okay, so the sources show China really hammering the DPP's stance on Taiwan independence, painting it as dangerous, provocative.
And the goal of that framing, according to the sources, what are they trying to achieve?
Well, the analysis suggests it's a deliberate shot at undermining the legitimacy of Taiwan's democracy, not just internationally, but crucially, trying to sway public opinion inside Taiwan.
So trying to weaken support for the current government within Taiwan itself.
That's what the sources seem to imply, yeah. Specific examples. Well, consistently calling the DPP Taiwan independent separatist forces, accusing them of ditching the 1992 consensus, which, the sources note, is Beijing's interpretation of one China, and saying that's what's damaging relations across the strait.
Basically painting the DPP as the only roadblock to peaceful relations.
Right. The sources also mention strong criticism of Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te's policies. This was back in January 2025, calling them provoking the mainland and endangering peace.
So making it sound like any tension is Taiwan's fault, specifically the leadership's fault.
Yes, that's the pattern the sources pick up on. They also discuss these accusations that the DPP is colluding with foreign forces, meaning the U.S., mostly trying to somehow isolate Taiwan internationally. And this narrative, the sources often link it to China, justifying its own increased military and economic pressure.
So if Taiwan reaches out for international support or strengthens alliances, China spins that as a negative collusion.
Exactly that framing, yes, according to the sources. And beyond that, the reports detail these misinformation campaigns. They were apparently quite noticeable during Taiwan's 2024 elections. Claims about DPP corruption, incompetence spread through various networks. The sources read this as a clear attempt to push voters towards candidates Beijing might prefer.
Wow, actively trying to meddle in their democratic process. So, okay, we've seen how the sources describe these two really potent negative narratives being built up.
Yes, and this is where the sources flag something really interesting. They identify these, well, apparent contradictions between what China says it wants or the image it puts out, claiming to be a victim, pushing for peace, cooperation, and then what the documents show its actual actions are, which often look pretty aggressive or coercive.
So it's not just a mismatch in tone, it's like the words and the actions are genuinely conflicting.
That's really the heart of the contradiction these sources are pointing to. They show China often presenting itself as, the wronged party, the defender of stability, while at the same time doing things that other countries, and the sources analyzing them, see as aggressive or destabilizing.
Let's get into those specific examples from the sources. How does this contradiction play out with China's neighbors, looking beyond just trade stuff for a moment?
Okay, so the sources talk about what some analysts are calling a double-track strategy. On one hand, you see China making these big diplomatic and economic efforts with ASEAN countries.
Like that resource deal with Brunei in Feb 2025, or the RCP trade helping push trade towards, nearly $1 trillion by 2024.
Precisely those examples, they're cited as the cooperation track. But ASEAN, and here's the contradiction, at the exact same time, the sources report all these incidents. Chinese Coast Guard ships harassing vessels, operating deep inside the exclusive economic zones, the EEZs, of places like Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam.
So shaking hands economically, but maybe pushing them around at sea.
That's the pattern the source describe. They mention China claiming territory Malaysia sees as its own and keeping Coast Guard ships parked in Malaysia's EEZ, which messes with their energy development. The sources also talk about China trying to isolate the Philippines, especially after the Philippines pushed back on maritime claims and got closer to the U.S. That included China running live-fire drills that looked aimed at intimidating Manila.
Yeah, that definitely seems hard to square with the narrative of just wanting peaceful coexistence.
The sources really highlight that apparent clash. Okay, now let's go back to Taiwan, looking at the military and cyber side of things.
Right, so the sources mentioned China saying it hopes for peaceful unification and pushing that one country, two systems idea for Taiwan.
Yes, that's the official line. But the sources document this huge ramp-up in military pressure that just seems, very contradictory to a peaceful approach.
What kind of scale are we talking about? What did the sources say?
Well, the reports cite just a massive number of air incursions into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, the ADIZ. Like 255 times in January 2025 alone, 311 in March 2025, and over 1,200 incursions documented in just the first few months of 2025. Plus, constant naval activity, 9 ships often detected around Taiwan in March 2025.
Over 1,200 air incursions in a few months. That's a staggering amount of military activity.
It really is. And the sources include analysis, like from the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, calling these frequent exercises rehearsals. There are also reports mentioned in the sources about China deploying new water bridge landing craft. Some analysts see that as potential preparation for an invasion.
Rehearsals, an invasion craft. Yeah, it's really difficult to see how those actions line up with saying you want peaceful unification.
The sources definitely highlight that sharp contrast. And the pressure isn't only military. The sources detail huge cyber attacks targeting Taiwan.
How bad are we talking, according to the sources?
The reports say something like an average of 2.4 million cyber attacks a day hitting Taiwanese government systems in 2024. And that number was reportedly going up in 2025.
2.4 million a day. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, and the sources say these attacks hit everything: government, diplomacy, industry, banks. Some are linked in the sources to state-backed groups, like one called Flax Typhoon, apparently trying to steal sensitive information.
So intense military drills, overwhelming cyber warfare, happening while they're talking about peaceful unification. This whole contradiction, claiming victimhood versus being the one applying pressure, it seems to pop up again and again in these sources.
It really does seem to be a significant pattern they identify. The sources give specific examples where China paints itself as the victim, while at the same time initiating actions others see as aggressive.
Like in the South China Sea.
Exactly. There, the sources say China often portrays the Philippines as just a pawn for the U.S. and Japan, painting itself as the victim of U.S. aggression. Simultaneously, China's conducting military patrols in disputed waters. And there was that incident cited from August 2024 where a Chinese Coast Guard ship actually fired a flare at a Philippine aircraft.
Firing a flare at an aircraft, that doesn't really sound like defensive victim behavior.
Well, the sources analyze it this way. China claimed it was conducting readiness patrols near Scarborough Shoal while accusing the Philippines of disrupting peace. So, essentially framing its own assertive actions as just defensive responses to supposed Philippine provocation.
That's a pretty clear example of flipping the script.
And towards Taiwan, the sources note China frames all those ADZ flights, the high-altitude balloons too, as just necessary national security measures, protecting sovereignty. But the analysis within the sources consistently reads these as clear, escalating pressure tactics aimed at wearing Taiwan down.
So offensive pressure gets labeled as a defensive necessity.
Right. On the economic front, the sources mention China framing those retaliatory tariffs on the U.S., like in early 2025, as defending free trade, blaming the U.S. for breaking WTO rules. Same with export controls on critical minerals framed publicly as national security. But the analysis in the sources tends to see these as direct economic coercion, retaliation for U.S. policies, just using those claims as cover.
It often seems like the stated reason is sort of a narrative layer on top of a strategic or retaliatory move.
That's the interpretation you find in these documents, yeah. Another example cited the arrest of 5 alleged Chinese spies in the Philippines in January 2025. But China's public statements around then, condemning Philippines' U.S. military drills as a threat.
So, allegedly running spies while complaining about the target's defensive partnerships. The contradiction really does seem to cut across military, cyber, economic spheres.
The sources definitely suggest it's a consistent feature. Let's maybe look specifically at trade contradictions now, because the documents detail this pattern, sometimes punitive measures, sometimes cooperation, seeming to depend on the politics of the moment.
So, using trade sometimes as a weapon, but also being practical when it suits them.
Exactly. The sources use Australia as a prime example. Remember China hitting Australian wine, coal, barley with tariffs between 2020 and 2023, largely seen as retaliation for Australia wanting a COVID origins inquiry. But trade-in, stuff China really needed, like iron ore, wasn't really touched, hit $120 billion in 2024. And then China lifted the barley tariffs, started buying coal again in 2025, and trade actually grew 8%.
Wow, so it's like a very selective pressure punish where you can make a political point, keep the essential stuff flowing, and then ease off when things change.
A calculated approach, it seems. With South Korea, the sources recall those boycotts over the Shiyadid missile system back in 2017. Reportedly cost Seoul billions. PT trade bounced back pretty strongly, hitting $310 billion by 2023, driven by things like semiconductors, EV batteries.
So economic pain as leverage, but then shared interests eventually bring things back.
That seems to be the dynamic observed. For Japan, despite all the tensions and U.S. tech restrictions, sources note China kept buying lots of Japanese machinery, over 10% of Japan's exports. And they even made exceptions for key things like industrial robots in 2023.
Maintaining those critical supply links, even amidst friction.
Yes. And Canada sources mentioned China slapping 100% tariffs on canola and stuff in 2024 after Canada put tariffs on Chinese EVs and metals. But UT, even with that tit-for-tat, overall trade between them still grew from like $86 billion in 2021 to $120 billion in 2024.
These examples really drive home how the sources portray China's trade game as this complex mix. Punishment and pragmatism, not just one simple policy. Pressure happens, but the bigger economic ties often keep growing.
Yeah, the sources paint a picture of a very adaptable, sometimes contradictory economic strategy.
Okay, so we've looked at the narratives, the contradictions. What do the sources say about the impact? How's the world reacting?
What about the impact inside China first, according to the sources?
Well, the sources suggest these negative stories about the U.S. and the DPP, they actually work pretty well domestically. They boost nationalism, rally support for the government.
And you see that reflected online, yeah, definitely. The sources even give examples, like citing an ex-user, a China patriot, posting things like, U.S. and DPP are teaming up to suppress us, must unite and fight back. You know, clearly echoing that external threat message. But the sources also add a note of caution that this intense framing might, maybe unintentionally, lead to the Chinese public having a kind of skewed or a less accurate view of the outside world.
Okay, shifting outside then, what's the international reaction based on the sources?
Well, the sources report this growing sense of caution, concern maybe, among quite a few other countries. It seems this gap, this disconnect between China's words and actions is getting noticed more and more.
It's getting harder for people to just ignore the contradictions.
That's what's implied. Like, the sources mention a 2025 U.S. report accusing China of weaponizing interdependence, especially using its leverage with critical resources like rare earths for political gain. And the sources also pick up on regular people, users on X, for instance, pointing out this duality publicly.
Like real-time commentary catching the contradiction.
Exactly. The sources quote users, like Emitter Azov, saying something like, China talks peace in the South China Sea. But then after their Coast Guard attacks Philippine ships, they tell the Philippines not to exaggerate. And another, at Michael71T, is quoted saying, China cries victim after being aggressive, but the world is watching the bullying at sea. And at Random Yoko apparently noted that Chinese nationalists show patriotic pride while claiming victim mentality. This contradiction severely harms the coherence of their stance.
Yeah, those quotes really seem to capture that international perception of the gap that the sources are describing. What about Taiwan specifically? How are they responding to all this pressure?
The sources note Taiwan's DPP government has been pretty active. They're focused on strengthening their own defenses, seriously boosting cybersecurity sources, mentioned a 4-year plan announced April 2025, and really working hard to build international cooperation, shore up support to push back against the pressure.
Building resilience at home and finding friends abroad.
Okay, so as we kind of bring this deep dive towards a close, what's the big picture takeaway from all these sources? What's the story they tell together?
Well, based strictly on the information and analysis in these documents, they really outline a consistent pattern. China seems to be constantly balancing this projected image, often as victim, promoter of peace, with actions across military, economic, cyberspaces that are frequently described in these same sources as aggressive, coercive, or just plain contradictory to that projected image.
And understanding these narratives, recognizing these potential contradictions that the sources point out, why is that important for you listening at home?
Well, because it gives you a really useful lens for making sense of the complex information you get bombarded with about this region. When you hear an official statement or see a headline, knowing that the sources point to this underlying pattern encourages you to look a bit deeper, to check the actions against the words. And like we'd always stress here, our job is just to help you make sense of the world by unpacking the information right from the sources you bring us. We're just laying out what these documents seem to indicate is going on.
Exactly. And these particular sources really underscore the value of looking past the rhetoric, scrutinizing the actual behavior. It really pushes you to use your own critical thinking skills to spot those contradictions that maybe aren't obvious right on the surface.
So to sum it all up then, the sources we dug into today describe China strategically building these powerful, often quite negative narratives about the U.S. and Taiwan, framing them as threats or troublemakers. But these same sources simultaneously detail a clear pattern of actions, aggressive moves in the South China Sea, major military and cyber pressure on Taiwan, using trade punitively that seem to directly contradict China's stated goals of peace or its image as a victim.
It's a complex picture, definitely a conflicting one, as laid out in these reports.
And as we wrap this up, the sources do mention that the long-term results of this complex strategy, this sort of tightrope walk between narrative and action, well, analysts are still debating it, and it clearly needs more watching. So maybe here's a final thought to leave you with. What do you think is the ultimate strategic aim, or maybe the unintended fallout, for any major power that consistently projects one image while, according to these sources anyway, acting in ways that seem to run directly counter to it?
Definitely something to chew on as you follow the news.
Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive into the sources.
So make sure you subscribe to the deep dive. You don't want to miss future updates on this.
Yeah.
And hey, while you're doing that, maybe check out our good friend Micky's YouTube channel too. We're always happy to give Micky a shout out.
Yeah, definitely check out Micky's stuff. Always interesting.